So we're talking about yield of reaction. Now, we already know how to calculate by stoichiometry how much product we should get. But the question becomes, what is it? Did we actually get it? And really that's what yield is all about. Now, if you look at, say, a recipe for muffins or something else, it'll often tell you how many people it should feed or how many muffins it should produce and things like that. And you may or may not have tried one of those things and ended up with less. And you could ask yourself, well, why do I have less? Why did it feed fewer people? Why did I only get 11 muffins and things like that? But we don't really care about that right now. We want to apply exactly the same thinking to chemistry, because in yield, in terms of chemistry, the yield of reactions, how much product did we actually get? Because really, many times that's why we're doing a chemical reaction, is to get something at the end. And we'll do this particularly industrially, and that means we're buying a bunch of stuff and we're hoping to make something and then turn around and sell it. So yield becomes a really important idea. Now, you've had time to read the question and you've had time to perhaps write it down, and you know how to do the stoichiometry, so we're not going to walk it through, but you could do that to calculate the amount of aluminum oxide that I can or should be able to or theoretically could make. But you'll notice that by doing the calculations, I don't have any aluminum oxide in my hands. So it doesn't really answer the question of, if I started with that amount, 86.5 grams of aluminum, measured it all out nice and carefully, and then did that reaction, how much would I actually walk away with? So the next part is to say, this is how much I should be able to make, but what do I actually do? And then how do I know how good it was? And that's really what we're talking about. So the number that we just calculated is a theoretical yield. So in theory, if I had that mass of starting material, I could potentially make the calculated mass of product. I almost said a word I didn't want to say yet. Okay, so if everything goes perfectly, well, you know that that's not going to happen. Even if you're really good at your work, even if you are really careful with your job and doing the reactions, it's probably not going to work out perfectly all the time. And it's generally, that's an accepted fact. And so then theoretical yield is always just a calculated amount, and we're always going to calculate it using stoichiometry. So good thing we're really good at stoichiometry. And the question will always be worded in this way. Now, I want to just sort of look at that question for a second, because you've seen a lot of stoichiometry questions already. Some of them were asking you to calculate a product. Some of them were asking you to calculate a reactant. But for a theoretical yield, anytime we have a reaction where the question is worded, how much product could I make from this much reactant, that could be called a theoretical yield question. So it's not going to be a separate type of question. It's just focusing on reactant to product. Okay, so actual yield is how much we actually get. And hopefully that's not too tricky. I know it's not. But that's it. So that one has to be a measured amount. Has to be measured. You actually have to do the experiment. You have to do the job to find out if you produce it. You can read a recipe for muffins that tells you it makes 12, but unless you actually do it, you won't know how many you can make from it. And then we'll have percent yield. And percent yield is the actual yield divided by the theoretical yield times 100. And before we think, oh, we got to write that down and be really, really careful about it, by all means, write it down. But think about what happens when you get a test. When you first look at the test, you might say to yourself, okay, it's out of 43. The most marks I could get, 100%, would be 43. You're actually going to get a little bit less. Hopefully not a lot less, but you're actually going to get probably less, because very few times will it be perfect. And then what will you do? When you get the test back, you'll take the amount that you actually got, where you had to do the test to get that mark, divide it by the amount that you could have got, theoretically, and that'll give you a number, which usually you'll multiply by 100 in your head. So theoretical yield, percent yield, actual yield are pretty much the same thing as getting a percent on a test. That would be your percent yield. Theoretical yield, the mark I told you is possible, and actual yield, what you actually get. So all the things that you do for a test after you get it back, pretty much what we're doing here. Okay, so if you look at that compared to what you actually do when you get a test. Okay, so we calculated out the 86.5 grams a few minutes ago, and hopefully you actually pushed the buttons and did the work as well. Sorry, didn't calculate the 86.5, that was our starting material. We calculated at 163.4 grams of product. That was a theoretical yield. Well, let's say that we did the lab, we collected the stuff, and we got less than that, 128.6 grams. So now we have 128.6 as our actual yield. The 163.4 is our theoretical yield. How close were we? Well, we find a percent yield, which is the amount that we got divided by the amount that we could have got times 100, and that's 78.7. Is that a good number? Is that a bad number? Whatever, it's a number. And we don't really care if it's good or bad, and that's going to be true for labs. There's no real prize for having the top yield. If you were trying to make this stuff industrially, you might want to try and get that number raised because of all the stuff you're buying and all the stuff that you could be producing, you're not producing, which means you're not selling, which means you're not making money. So at the industrial level, a percent yield is going to be really important. So that's really all there is to it. But I really want to emphasize the point that there's no real surprises here. The things that we are doing are things that we've done. But try and keep straight in your mind theoretical yield and actual yield, because when you see those terms, they're going to sometimes they feel different, but they're really just what could I make, calculated out. What did I actually make? And if you compare that to a test and how you figure a percent on a test, it's always going to be pretty easy. We'll talk to you in class.